So again, my name is Stephen Buccini, and I spent this past summer at the Aspen Tech Policy Hub, which is a new fellowship for technologists, and that's broadly defined. So I think most people in this room would qualify. It's a fellowship to allow folks like us to apply our industry and technical expertise to public policy problems. And at the fellowship, I met my colleague, Brandy Noneke, who's the director of the Citrus Policy Lab at UC Berkeley. And she was telling me in those first few days of the fellowship about some of the research she was doing at Citrus Policy Lab, which included investigating how bots were influencing discourse on social media platforms. I thought this was fascinating because she wrote a scraper to interface with the public API to collect her data set. And I thought, wow, what a vast improvement from the way that I thought academic research was being conducted, which is you put up some flyers in the hall, pay some students to come by to participate in some crude facsimile of how humans are interacting online. We actually just have these platforms that are collecting unique, high-quality data sets that really granularly mimic and portray how humans are interacting online. It seems like an inefficiency in the marketplace, right? It seems like Brandy, who's a very qualified researcher with a large track record, should just be able to query some portal and get the full data set she needs without having to do all this legwork, especially as a non-technical person. So Brandy and I resolved to spend our 3 months at the fellowship building a bridge between industry and academia. And we thought the bridge would look like this, straight and narrow. But it ended up looking a lot more like this by the time we were done. There are a lot of planks missing from this bridge, just like there are large gaps in the policy landscape. And those can be categorized into 3 separate groups. The first is legal, the second is technological, and the third is philosophical. So I think one question that I want to answer right off the bat is why now? Why I'm on the stage now? Because the platforms have been around for a while. Academics have wanted these data sets for a while. So why is now the opportunity, do we have an opportunity to move? And that has to go back to the 2016 United States presidential election, where in the months following, there was a lot of discussion about what roles, if any, these platforms played in influencing the outcome of the election. And so for the first time, academia, government, and industry were all aligned on one research question. So that provided an opportunity for us to collaborate in a way that was never done before because there were differing views about what was important, what questions were important. And before, there was some tension between industry and academia, in large part because of Cambridge Analytica. Remember that data exfiltration was actually done by an academic. And so the concept of sharing this data, even in a formal arrangement, a lot of industry folks were somewhat tepid about this because of what had happened previously and the flack that they received for something that really was not under their control. So the new innovation that came about shortly after the election was something called Social Science One. And this was a new partnership between Facebook and some academics. And its novel innovation was this introduction of a third party. So the value that the third party provided to industry was that it solicited applications for research requests. It vetted those applications, made sure that it was the research questions were valid. They weren't just hatch jobs by researchers who wanted to take down the man. And they also made sure that the researchers had a track record, right? They weren't just someone who just wanted the data for other purposes, whether it's to sell it on the black market or whatever else. To academia, the value that the third party provided was the third party had special access to go into the walled garden to see what sort of data sets were available and what sort of research questions academia could ask, because previously they didn't have that level of transparency into what was actually hiding inside these walled gardens. So Social Science One has been around for like a year and a half at this point. But unfortunately, we're no longer the Three Musketeers. We're in a standoff right now between government, academia, and industry. And what happens as a programmer when things go wrong? In a lot of cases, we do a post-mortem, right? We analyze the problem, we figure out what went wrong, and we change our process to make sure it never happens again. So Social Science One is not dead, so maybe calling it a post-mortem isn't entirely accurate, but I think it would be useful to actually look at some of the problems that it faced and then end with how we can move forward. So going back to our 3 core problems, I want to start with the legal context. So first, GDPR is the law of the land. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this acronym, but for those of you who are not, you may recognize bars like this. The European Union's General Data Privacy Regulation regulates a lot of different things. It's very, very broad and complex, but today we're only going to be focusing on just one of those concepts, and that is the concept of personal data. So in the GDPR world, personal data is any data point that can be used to uniquely identify an individual. But it can also mean any unification or composition of identifiers that create a higher order identifier that can uniquely identify someone. And this presents a pretty interesting epistemological question. Because if you want to share your data, it could be something that seems totally innocuous to you, but how can you guarantee that it can never be unified with some data set that you may not even know about to uniquely identify someone, thus violating GDPR? So I kind of think of it as, especially at some of these large platforms where you have tons of data, many, many years worth, of all sorts of different interactions that could be used to uniquely identify someone. I kind of think of it as a huge dam. And it only takes one small crack to lead to catastrophic failure. Now, what does catastrophic failure look like in the GDPR regulation world? A cool $57 million. And if we think back to Annalisa's talk, this regulation is relatively new. It only went into effect in the spring of 2018. And it's very, very complex, as I said earlier. So there are a lot of gray areas where there hasn't been regulatory guidance issued, and there hasn't yet been clarification from the courts. And as we know from Annalisa's talk, that the US cares a lot about liability. And a lot of these platforms are based in the United States. So one of the first challenges that we saw with Social Science 1 was that a lot of lawyers at these big tech companies felt like they did not have sufficient regulatory clarification to enter into these sorts of partnerships while protecting their client from liability. So next, we're going to move on to the technological gaps that exist. And one thing that I think is pretty interesting that Social Science 1 did is they almost foresaw the complexity that GDPR was going to bring to the table, and they came up with a clever solution. And that solution was, what if we didn't actually have to work under GDPR at all? Remember, GDPR only applies to personal data. So if you can anonymize your data, it actually is actually not covered by GDPR. Now, as programmers, we know that one of the easiest ways to anonymize data is hashing. For those of you who aren't familiar with hashing, you can think of it as a black box that takes some input and outputs a fingerprint. And one really unique property of this is that it's not reversible. You can't take the fingerprint and recover the source data. So if you want to share personal data, you can feed it through this black box, get some fingerprints, spread the fingerprints around, and no adversary is going to be able to take those fingerprints and recover the original personal data, meaning that you've violated GDPR in some way. But you'll also notice that the fingerprint looks nothing like the original. So we lose all the interesting granularity of the data, the trend lines in the data when we hash it, that's useful that academics need to conduct their research. So there's a new concept out that some of you might have heard of called differential privacy. So differential privacy is a new way of anonymizing data that preserves the trends in the data. So this seems like the best of both worlds. We can anonymize our data set, meaning that we don't have to abide by GDPR, while the academics still have access to the trends that they need to come up with new insights. But there are still a couple problems that we found with with differential privacy when it came to implementation. So the first is the slider. Differential privacy allows for sort of an adjustment of the level of privacy guarantees that you have. But GDPR actually hasn't thought of anonymous data or anonymization as, it thinks of it as black and white. It doesn't think of it as a gradient. So again, the lawyers come into play and say, well, we can't be sure what GDPR's interpretation of anonymization is, what level it is, what threshold we'll need to meet. So automatically, they were wary of the solution. There are a couple other problems, too. So one of the key areas of research in this world of election research and how social media platforms impact elections is the concept of the spread of disinformation. So Facebook tried to put together a data set that included a list of links and the number of times they've been shared to see how information was spreading through their platform. But as we know from a lot of data sets, there's always a long tail. And the presence of outliers in your data set, especially mins and maxes, can actually weaken some of the guarantees that GDPR provides. And so there's a solution to this. But the solution comes with trade-offs, like most things in technology. The solution is to establish thresholds above or below which you chop off data, but that can bias your data set, of course. And not only that, but that weakens some of the privacy guarantees brought about by GDPR. The other problem is that to set the thresholds, a lot of times you have to bring humans into the loop, right, to actually figure out where the thresholds should be set. So you can't necessarily just slap differential privacy everywhere and sort of get the guarantees. You actually need a human looking at the data trends to set these thresholds correctly and make sure the privacy guarantees are at an appropriate level, which obviously slows things down. Humans can't work as fast as computers. But also, once you bring a human into the loop, you introduce the opportunity for error. And what happens when a human makes a mistake? $57 million fines. The last thing I want to talk about is the philosophical gaps. And I will admit that right now I'm going to editorialize a bit, but please bear with me. So the first thing that is definitely a problem is that it's not exactly clear that our sort of general concept of what businesses should be doing aligns with the sharing of personal data for academic public interest research, right? Very few of these social media platforms actually have buy-in to do this sort of work from the C-suite. And if you think about the individual engineers and the middle managers who are tasked with this, people get promoted by hitting OKRs. Most OKRs at these businesses are actually to increase the shareholder return. And providing these sorts of services is actually a cost center. So we found that a lot of these resources, or a lot of the groups that are actually working on these problems within these companies are severely under-resourced. And unfortunately, they haven't been able to hit the timelines that they initially set out to achieve because of the lack of resources that they have. Another question that's come about is that so far the focus with Social Science 1 has been on the differential privacy. We think that's the key to sort of unlocking this logjam. But the problem is that we've seen some folks at Facebook have difficulty with this, and Facebook has some of the smartest engineers on the planet. So if Facebook is having difficulty anonymizing their admittedly really gnarly data set, startups that are focused on just making it to the next quarter, achieving profitability, whatever the case might be, they're probably not going to have the engineering cycles and maybe not the engineering expertise to be able to apply differential privacy to their data sets in order to share them with researchers. So if Social Science 1 sets differential privacy as the standard for enabling this sort of data sharing agreement, we may win the battle, right? We may unlock these Facebook data sets, but we might lose the war because we've set the floor too high. This matrix has been really helpful for helping me understand the regulatory landscape. So we kind of have a dichotomy between private info and public info that's being shared publicly or not shared publicly. So in the upper right-hand corner, we have public info that's shared publicly. This is the digital transparency movement. This allows me to enter in a few keystrokes, look up my great-grandfather's immigration record into this country. That's awesome. I think everybody's on board with that. In the bottom right, we have public info that's not yet shared publicly, but we have tools to uncover that information and let it release to the public, make sure that it's released to the public. For example, Freedom of Information Act. And there are some, obviously, checks in place to make sure that the UFO files in Area 51 aren't being leaked. In the upper left-hand corner, we have private info that's being shared publicly. We just call that social media. And in the bottom right-hand corner, that's where the gap is, right? That's where there are some really interesting data sets where there's really no regulation to guide us. And so that's why today, Brandy and I want to make a strong call for a HIPAA for public interest research. HIPAA being the regulation that governs medical records and facilitates the use of medical records, private health information for medical research that benefits us all. Now, my father's been a physician for 30 years, so I've seen up close and personal how scaloric and how bureaucratic that industry is. But I think it's pretty telling that we think our industry is really innovative and nimble, and we can't figure out how to share some things like phone numbers. We can't come up with a framework. Whereas the medical industry has figured out how to share really private data sets that some of which might be pre-existing conditions that could affect how you are treated or get insurance or whatever the case might be. Maybe you have a condition that has a lot of stigma attached to it. They figured out how to share this information. And admittedly, it's not perfect, but at least they are able to do research in this manner. So what would a HIPAA for public interest research look like? Well, Brandy and I think it needs to include a couple things that we don't have right now. The first is safe harbors, both for academia and for industry. As we know, in the United States, these platforms care a lot about liability. So we need to make sure there's a clear safe harbor for them if they're acting in the public interest to ensure that they are shielded from liability, whatever lessons are learned from their data sets. But we also need a safe harbor for academics as well, so they can look at really granular user-level data without necessarily being held to the same protections that I, as a random citizen who's trying to look at different data sets, might be held to. But there also needs to be accountability as well. Again, with Cambridge Analytica, we need to make sure that if another situation happens like that again, where an academic violates the rules of the conduct within the safe harbor, that criminal penalties are leveraged in order to enforce that code of conduct. The interesting thing about GDPR right now is that it regulates data, right? It has some criteria about whether or not data is personal or not. And if it is, then a bunch of rules and regulations are applied to it, controlling how you collect, store, analyze, et cetera. But we think that the HIPAA for public interest research should regulate the process. Regulating the data is not flexible enough. We've seen that. Regulating the process, we think we should look to the financial industry. Think about insider trading, regulating insider trading, for example. When you try to determine whether or not someone has committed insider trading using privileged information to buy stocks and make money, you don't look at the trades themselves, right? You don't look at the metadata of the trade. You look at the process that led to someone buying the stock. And we think GDPR, or the new regulation to facilitate this type of research, should do the same. Finally, we need to trust, but we also need to verify. It's been pretty clear through this partnership between industry and academia that it's a relatively toothless agreement, and there's still really no way for us as external stakeholders to understand whether or not the data sets we're receiving are actually representative of the whole data set, right? So we can trust them, but there really should be some sort of third-party verification process, just like there is in other industries, to make sure that the data that's being revealed and being shared is actually representative, and that we really have full access to all that we need to conduct the research to facilitate and benefit the public interest. So Brandy and I created something that we are calling PIRA, the Public Interest Research Alliance, and this is a multi-stakeholder collaboration group that's meant to get a lot more voices in the room. Because Social Science one problem that we saw was that it was between Facebook and academics from Harvard and Stanford, and there are obviously a lot of voices being left out of that room. And we were learned in our just 3 short months working on this program how complex and nuanced this issue is. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm really excited to be on the stage here today, because I want to issue a strong call to action. All of you have really unique perspectives, global perspectives that need to be incorporated into the discussion so that moving forward, we're able to make sure that we have a flexible regulation that works for everybody while preserving user privacy and enabling the further understanding of how humans are interacting with each other online. Now, why is discussion so important if really nothing's getting done and the current situation is so poor? Well, I have good news. And that is because we are all pioneers on this frontier. The California Consumer Privacy Act, which is similar to GDPR in some ways, just went into effect a couple of weeks ago, and that's going to spur federal privacy regulation. So this is our opportunity for a cohesive, comprehensive United States privacy regulation is going to go into effect most likely, and we have the opportunity right now to actually shape that. And so that's another reason why I'm excited to be here in 2020, because we actually have the ability to do something about that. And I can tell you firsthand that everybody in this room, that's exactly the perspectives, possesses the perspectives that regulators want to hear, because a lot of them have no understanding whatsoever of the complex philosophical discussions that we're having here, or the complex security arrangements that you all work so hard to protect user data. It's our job as citizens to actually inform our representatives, our senators, folks within the government establishment of exactly what we're seeing on the ground, so that the regulation that results is flexible while maintaining user privacy, and again, helps us better understand ourselves. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. Our contact information is on the slide. I'll be around after. We're really looking forward to hearing from you all. Thanks so much.